In his courtroom, Judge Arthur Harrington was a king, and he loved to play games with his subjects. So when 17-year-old Leo Washington stood before him, accused of stealing a Porsche, the judge invented a cruel little game to amuse himself. Truth or lie? He sneered at the quiet black kid from the wrong side of the tracks, mistaking his silence for guilt. A fatal mistake. He had no idea he was mocking a self-taught legal genius with a 130 IQ. The judge thought he was laying a trap, but he had just challenged a grandmaster, not realizing he was merely a pawn in a game he was about to lose spectacularly. The Superior Court of Cook County, Illinois, was Judge Arthur Harrington's kingdom. For 30 years, he had presided over its proceedings, his once sharp sense of justice having eroded into a cynical, hardened arrogance. He believed he could smell guilt the way a hound smells fear, and when 17-year-old Leo Washington was brought before him, Harrington's senses screamed guilty. The charge was grand theft auto, specifically the theft of a brand new Porsche 911 Carrera, a car worth more than the entire block Leo lived on. The evidence presented by the ambitious Assistant District Attorney Vincent Pike seemed straightforward. The car was found abandoned 2 blocks from Leo's apartment building. A single partial fingerprint on the rearview mirror was a match for Leo. An anonymous tip had led the police to him. To Pike and Harrington, it was a classic case of a joyriding kid from the projects getting in over his head. Leo stood beside his court-appointed lawyer, Rebecca Sloan. She was a good public defender, but she was overworked and underpaid, juggling dozens of cases just like this one. She had advised Leo to take a plea deal. The evidence was thin but circumstantial enough to be dangerous. A jury might not see the nuances, Leo, she had whispered to him before the hearing. They'll see you. They'll see the car, and they'll connect the dots Pike gives them. Leo had simply nodded, his face an unreadable mask of calm. It was this very calmness that irritated Judge Harrington. He was used to seeing fear, defiance, or crocodile tears. Leo's quiet confidence felt like an insult, a silent challenge to his authority. Mr. Washington, Harrington's voice boomed, cutting through the low murmur of the courtroom. You've heard the charges. You've seen the evidence Mr. Pike has presented. Your own lawyer has advised you on the generous plea bargain offered by the state. Yet you stand there silent. I find that curious. Leo's eyes met the judge's. There was no fear in them, only a deep, unnerving focus. I am innocent, Your Honor. The words were spoken softly, yet they carried the weight of conviction. Harrington chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. This was the part of the job he perversely enjoyed, breaking the defiant ones. Innocent, you say? A Porsche 911 just happens to be abandoned near your home, and your fingerprint just happens to be in it. A remarkable coincidence. He looked at Rebecca Sloan. Counselor, is your client always this fanciful? Rebecca stiffened. My client maintains his innocence, Your Honor. We believe the evidence is circumstantial and fails to meet the burden of proof. Harrington waved a dismissive hand. Yes, the burden of proof. Of course. He turned his gaze back to Leo, a cruel glint in his eye. All right, Mr. Washington, I'm in a sporting mood today. Let's set aside the legal jargon for a moment. Let's play a little game. We'll call it truth or lie. It's very simple. I'll ask you a question, and you will preface your answer with either truth or lie. It's a chance for you to show me your character, a chance to convince me you're not the common thug the evidence suggests you are. Do you understand? A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. Even Ada Pike looked momentarily surprised. This was highly unorthodox, a blatant abuse of judicial power. Rebecca Sloan shot to her feet. Your Honor, I must object. This is not a game. This is a preliminary hearing with my client's future at stake. This game has no legal standing and is profoundly prejudicial. Sit down, counselor. Harrington's voice was like a whip crack. Your objection is noted and overruled. Your client is a juvenile being charged as an adult. I have broad discretion here. I am trying to ascertain his character for the purpose of bail and to see if this case is even worth the state's time for a full trial. Now, he said, his eyes locking back onto Leo, do you accept my little challenge? Or are you afraid the truth isn't on your side? It was a trap, a public humiliation ritual designed to make Leo look either foolish or guilty. Rebecca looked at her client, silently pleading with him to refuse. But Leo's expression hadn't changed. After a long moment, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I will play your game, Your Honor." Rebecca Sloan sank into her chair, her heart sinking with her. The boy was going to be eaten alive. Harrington smiled, a predator's smile. "Excellent. Let's begin. A simple one to start. Did you, on the night of July 22nd, steal a Porsche 911 from a locked garage in the Lincoln Park neighborhood?" Leo looked straight at the judge, his voice steady and clear. "Lie. I did not steal that car, Your Honor." Harrington's smile widened. "Of course you'd say that. Let's try another. The arresting officer's report states you were uncooperative and sullen upon your arrest. Is that an accurate description of your behavior?" Leo paused, his eyes flicking for a fraction of a second to Ada Pike, then back to the judge. "Truth. I was silent because I knew that anything I said could and would be used against me in a court of law. I was simply exercising my Fifth Amendment right, a right affirmed in Miranda v. Arizona, 384 U.S. 436. The courtroom, which had been holding a collective breath, let out a quiet gasp. It wasn't just the answer, but the citation, delivered flawlessly. Judge Harrington's smile faltered for the first time. He stared at the boy, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. He had expected a simple yes or no, not a legal lesson. Rebecca Sloan's head snapped up. She stared at Leo, her mind racing. Miranda v. Arizona? She hadn't prepped him on that. Where did a 17-year-old from Englewood learn to cite Supreme Court precedent? Harrington recovered quickly, his tone hardening. "A smart mouth, I see. You've watched some television. Very well, let's get to the heart of it. That fingerprint on the rearview mirror. Is it yours?" This was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, the one piece of physical evidence linking Leo to the car. A denial would be a lie, easily disproven. An admission would be a confession. It was the perfect pincer move. Leo took a deep breath. The courtroom was dead silent. "Truth," he said, his voice ringing with newfound confidence. "The fingerprint found on the rearview mirror of the Porsche is mine, but I have never, in my entire life, been inside that car." The contradiction hung in the air, a puzzle thrown at the feet of the king in his own castle. Judge Harrington stared, his mind struggling to process the statement. It was an admission and a denial, a truth that sounded like an impossible lie. He felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation. He was no longer in control of his own game. A confused murmur rippled through the gallery. Ada Pike scoffed audibly, shaking his head as if to dismiss the sheer absurdity of Leo's statement. How could his fingerprint be in a car he'd never been in? It was a nonsensical riddle, and Pike assumed it was the desperate gambit of a cornered liar. Judge Harrington, however, was more intrigued than dismissive. The boy's confidence was a puzzle. It wasn't the bluster of a common criminal. It was the serene certainty of a chess player who sees 3 moves ahead. "Explain yourself, Mr. Washington," Harrington demanded, his voice tight. "You preface your statement with truth, yet it is a logical impossibility. Are you trying to make a fool of this court?" "Never, Your Honor," Leo replied respectfully. He turned slightly, addressing not just the judge, but the entire room. "Your Honor, you wanted to play a game of truth. The whole truth is often more complex than a simple yes or no." Rebecca Sloan was now on the edge of her seat, her earlier despair replaced by a dawning, electrifying curiosity. She leaned in and whispered, "Leo, what are you doing?" "Trust me," he whispered back, his eyes never leaving the judge. Harrington leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, a scowl on his face. He felt the proceedings slipping from his grasp. He had initiated this game to expose the boy as a fool. Instead, he was being drawn into a web of his own making. But his pride wouldn't let him stop. "Very well," the judge said. "Another question. The anonymous tip that led the police to your apartment. Do you have any idea who made that call?" Ada Pike shuffled his papers, looking confident. The anonymous tip was a useful, if unverifiable, piece of the narrative. It suggested someone in Leo's own community knew he was guilty. Leo's gaze was unwavering. "Truth. I do not know for certain who made the call, but I know why it was made. It was made to direct law enforcement to a convenient suspect, to ensure that their investigation stopped with me and went no further. The caller created a ghost, Your Honor, a phantom suspect to distract from the real perpetrator. A ghost, Harrington repeated, his voice laced with sarcasm. Are we in a courtroom or a campfire? Mr. Pike, is the state in the habit of chasing phantoms? No, Your Honor, Pike said smoothly. The state is in the habit of following credible evidence. The fingerprint, the proximity of the vehicle to the defendant's residence. These are not phantoms. They are facts. Let's talk about those facts, Leo said, his voice rising in volume for the first time. He was still playing the game. Judge, another question, please. Harrington was taken aback by the boy's audacity, but the gallery was captivated. A journalist from the Chicago Tribune, there to cover a different case, had started taking vigorous notes. The judge felt a dozen pairs of eyes on him, waiting. Fine, Harrington snapped. The car was reported stolen from the residence of Mr. Lawrence Belmont, a prominent real estate developer. Did you know Mr. Belmont or anyone in his family? It was a question designed to explore motive, to perhaps uncover a grudge or a connection that would explain the theft. Leo's response was immediate and sharp. Lie, I do not know Mr. Belmont personally, but I have done my research. Mr. Belmont is a very powerful man, but he also has a son, Chadwick Belmont III, who is 19 years old. A son with a sealed juvenile record. A son who, according to his social media, which the police apparently never bothered to check, has a passion for high-performance European cars. Pike shot to his feet. Objection. This is baseless speculation. The defendant is attempting to deflect blame by slandering a private citizen. Where are you going with this, Mr. Washington? Harrington warned, his gavel hovering over the block. I am going to the truth, Your Honor, Leo said, his voice ringing with clarity. He looked directly at Ada Pike. Mr. Pike, a question for you, if the judge permits. It's part of the game after all. Before Harrington could intervene, Leo pressed on. Mr. Pike, truth or lie, in your haste to secure a conviction, did you check the service records for the stolen Porsche? Pike was flustered. That's irrelevant. The car was stolen. It is the most relevant question of all, Leo countered. Did you or did you not check the service records at the dealership where Mr. Belmont purchased the car 3 months ago? Fletcher's European Motors on the north side? The specificity was staggering. Rebecca Sloane's jaw was practically on the floor. She hadn't checked that. She hadn't had the time or resources to dig that deep on a simple grand theft auto case. How did Leo know this? Judge Harrington stared at Leo, then at the sputtering ADA. Well, Mr. Pike, did you? No, Your Honor. There was no reason to. We had the fingerprint. Pike's voice lacked its earlier confidence. Then allow me to tell you what you would have found, Leo said, his voice commanding the room. He was no longer a defendant. He was a lecturer. On July 15th, 1 week before the alleged theft, my mother, who was a cleaner for a third-party commercial cleaning service, was assigned a shift at Fletcher's European Motors. While she was cleaning the customer lounge, I was waiting for her, sitting in a designated area. The dealership manager, a kind man, saw me reading a book and offered me a bottle of water. I read for 2 hours while my mother finished her shift. He paused, letting the information settle. That book, he continued, was an introduction to evidence law, and I have a photographic memory. I remember every page. I also remember the manager asking me if I liked cars. He let me sit in one of the floor models, a beautiful silver Porsche 911 Carrera, the same model as the one that was stolen. I remember adjusting the rearview mirror to look at myself in it. I left a perfect fingerprint right in the middle of it. The courtroom was utterly silent. The impossible statement from earlier, the fingerprint is mine, but I have never been inside that car, suddenly snapped into focus. He had never been inside the stolen car. He had been inside an identical one at the dealership. Harrington's face was a mask of disbelief. Are you suggesting? I am not suggesting, Your Honor. I am stating a truth, Leo said firmly. The rearview mirror from the showroom car was swapped with the one in Mr. Belmont's car. It's a simple procedure, a few screws and a wire harness. Something a person with knowledge of cars like, say, Chad Belmont could do in under 5 minutes. It was the perfect way to plant evidence. To frame a ghost. Ada Pike was pale. This is a fantasy, a ridiculous, convoluted story. Is it? Leo shot back. Truth or lie, Mr. Pike? Did the crime scene unit dust the entire car for prints, or did they stop once they found a match for me on the mirror? Pike didn't answer. His silence was the answer. Rebecca Sloan finally found her voice. She stood, not with the trepidation of before, but with the fire of a lawyer who suddenly had a cannon on her side. Your Honor, in light of my client's testimony, I move for the immediate release of the service records from Fletcher's European Motors and a full forensic re-examination of the vehicle in question, specifically the rearview mirror assembly, to check for signs of tampering. Judge Harrington stared down at the 17-year-old boy who had just hijacked his courtroom and dismantled the state's case, using nothing but the rules of a cruel, foolish game. The game was over, but the trial had just begun. The atmosphere in the courtroom had undergone a seismic shift. The smug certainty of Judge Harrington and Ada Pike had evaporated, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. The journalist from the Tribune was typing furiously on his laptop, sensing a story far bigger than a routine hearing. Rebecca Sloan, for her part, looked at her client with a mixture of awe and profound respect. She wasn't just defending a kid from Englewood anymore. She was representing a mind. Judge Harrington cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. He was trapped. To deny Rebecca's motion now would be a blatant act of obstruction, an admission that he cared more for his own authority than for the truth. The game he had started had given Leo a legitimate platform to introduce exculpatory theories that would have otherwise been dismissed as desperate ramblings. The court will take a brief recess, Harrington announced, his voice strained. Miss Sloan, Mr. Pike, in my chambers, now. As the judge swept from the room, his black robes trailing behind him like a thundercloud, Rebecca put a hand on Leo's arm. Leo, how? How did you know all of this? I read, Leo said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. When I was arrested, they gave me a copy of the police report. It listed the car's VIN. I memorized it. At the library, I used the public computer to look up the VIN. It traced back to the dealership and the date of sale. I connected it to the date my mom cleaned the dealership. I knew my print was on that display model. The rest, he shrugged slightly, was logical deduction. The only way for my fingerprint to get from the dealership car to the stolen car was for the mirror itself to be moved. Rebecca stared at him, dumbfounded. He hadn't just read the police report. He had investigated his own case from a jail cell in a public library, using nothing but his own intellect. The IQ of 130 that his school records had noted wasn't just a number, it was a weapon. In the judge's chambers, the mood was explosive. What was that, Vincent? Harrington hissed, rounding on the ADA. You bring me a case with a fingerprint and a half-baked tip, and you don't even do the most basic due diligence? You didn't check the service records? You didn't ask why the only print in the entire vehicle belonged to a boy who claims he was never in it? Pike was sweating, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Arthur, come on, it was a solid case. Kid from the slums, expensive car, fingerprint. It's a slam dunk 99 times out of 100. How was I supposed to know we'd stumble on the 1 in a million kid who's a secret legal scholar and whose mother just happens to clean the car dealership in question? That's your job, Harrington roared. Your job is to anticipate these things, to build a case so ironclad that a ridiculous story like that couldn't possibly be true. But you didn't because you, like me, saw the boy and assumed you knew everything. Now there's a reporter out there, and this entire fiasco is on the record. Rebecca Sloan stood silently, letting them implode. When they finally paused for breath, she spoke, her voice cold and professional. Judge, my client has presented a viable alternative theory supported by verifiable facts. His alibi for the night of the theft, that he was at home helping his mother study for her GED exam, has been ignored by the ADA's office. I am formally requesting the dealership records, a full forensic sweep of the Porsche, and a court order for the social media and cell phone records of one Chadwick Belmont III. You can't be serious, Pike spluttered. You want to drag the son of Lawrence Belmont into this based on the word of a teenage car thief? He's not a car thief. He's my client. Rebecca retorted, her eyes like steel. And his word has been more credible today than the entirety of the state's case. If Chad Belmont is innocent, he has nothing to hide. Unless, of course, you already know something about Mr. Belmont, Vincent? Pike flinched. The shot hit its mark. It was an open secret in the DA's office that sons of the city's elite, like Chad Belmont, often got a pass on minor infractions. It was entirely plausible that Pike, or someone above him, had made a deal. Pin the theft on some random kid and make it go away, ensuring Lawrence Belmont's continued political and financial support. Harrington rubbed his temples, a headache pounding behind his eyes. His fun little game had blown up in his face, threatening to expose the rot, not just in this one case, but in the system he oversaw. He was outmaneuvered, and he knew it. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "The court will grant the order for the dealership and vehicle forensics. We will hold off on Mr. Belmont's records for now. We reconvene in 48 hours. And Vincent," he added, his voice dangerously low, "your case had better be airtight by then, or this will be the last case you ever try in my courtroom." When they returned to the courtroom, the energy was palpable. Judge Harrington, his face a stony mask, announced his decision. A wave of excitement went through the gallery. As a bailiff came to escort Leo, the boy paused and looked directly at the judge. He wasn't finished playing. "Your Honor," Leo said. "What is it now, Mr. Washington?" Harrington asked, weary. "Just one last part of the game. A truth. The legal principle of Brady v. Maryland holds that the prosecution is required to disclose all exculpatory evidence to the defense. That includes evidence that may impeach the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses or point to another suspect. By failing to investigate the possibility of a different suspect, like Mr. Belmont, even after I raise the issue, Ada Pike may be in violation of my constitutional rights." He delivered the lines with the precision of a seasoned law professor. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was putting the entire prosecution on trial. He was showing the judge, and everyone else, that he knew the rules better than they did. Judge Harrington stared at him, a cold dread creeping into his heart. This wasn't a joyrider. This wasn't a common thug. This was a prodigy, and in his arrogance, he had handed him a sword and dared him to use it. The judge now knew, with sickening certainty, that this was a battle he was going to lose. The 48-hour recess was a whirlwind of frantic activity. For ADA Vincent Pike, it was a desperate scramble to salvage his case and his career. For Rebecca Sloan and Leo, it was a methodical hunt for the truth, guided by Leo's extraordinary mind. Rebecca, now fully convinced of Leo's genius, worked with a renewed sense of purpose. She secured the court order and personally went to Fletcher's European Motors. The manager, a middle-aged man named Robert, remembered Leo and his mother vividly. "Quiet kid, very polite," Robert recalled as he pulled up the service records. "Read a book the whole time. Yeah, I let him sit in the 911 on the floor. Figured it's good to let a kid dream." The dealership's inventory records were the first bombshell. They showed that the floor model Porsche, the one Leo had sat in, had been sold 2 days after his visit to Chad Belmont. Chad hadn't bought the car. He had only come in to look at it. But the key detail was that he had spent nearly an hour with the vehicle, ostensibly checking its features. Plenty of time to acquire a fingerprint from the mirror if he'd come prepared. The second bombshell came from the forensic lab. The new analysis of the stolen Porsche was rushed through at Rebecca's insistence. The report was definitive. The rear-view mirror assembly showed clear signs of tampering. Tiny microscopic scratches on the screw heads were inconsistent with factory installation. Furthermore, the wiring harness connecting the mirror's auto-dimming feature had been crudely respliced, not unplugged from a standard connector. It was the work of an amateur, not a professional mechanic. While Rebecca gathered the physical evidence, Leo worked on the legal strategy from the small library in his juvenile holding facility. He'd been granted bail, but his mother couldn't afford it. Using the books available, he began to draft what he called a chain of logic, a document laying out the sequence of events not as speculation, but as a series of probabilities. When Rebecca visited him, he handed her a stack of meticulously handwritten notes. "It's not just about the mirror," he explained, his finger tracing a line on the page. "It's about behavior. Chad Belmont's social media went dark the day after the car was stolen. No posts, no comments. For a 19-year-old who posts 10 times a day, that's an anomaly. It suggests consciousness of guilt. He had also found something else. I read through old articles about his father, Lawrence Belmont. 3 years ago, he was involved in a zoning dispute. The lead prosecutor who made the problem disappear for him, a rising star in the DA's office, Vincent Pike. Rebecca's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a cover-up for a joyriding son. It was payback for a political favor. Pike wasn't just cutting corners. He was likely an active participant in the frame-up. When court reconvened, the room was packed. The Tribune reporter had published a tantalizing online piece titled, "Teen Genius Plays Judge's Own Game, Accuses Tycoon's Son in Porsche Theft," and it had gone viral. The public gallery was overflowing with journalists, law students, and curious citizens. Judge Harrington banged his gavel, his face grim. He looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept. The spotlight was now on him, and he knew it. "Mr. Pike," Harrington began, his voice devoid of its former arrogance, "does the state wish to proceed?" "We do, Your Honor," Pike said, trying to project confidence. "The defendant's story is elaborate, but it is just that, a story. The fact of the fingerprint remains." "Then the defense would like to call our first witness," Rebecca said, standing tall. "Robert, the sales manager from Fletcher's European Motors." Robert's testimony confirmed Leo's account. He identified Leo as the boy in the waiting room and confirmed he had allowed him to sit in the floor model. Then Rebecca presented the dealership records showing Chad Belmont's extended inspection of the very same car. Next, she called the lead forensic technician. He explained in dry, clinical detail the evidence of tampering on the rearview mirror. He concluded that the mirror had, with a high degree of scientific certainty, been removed and reinstalled. With every piece of evidence, Pike's face grew paler. He feebly cross-examined the witnesses, but their testimony was unshakable. The narrative he had built was crumbling brick by brick. Finally, Rebecca played her trump card. "Your Honor, the defense now moves to introduce the sworn affidavit of my client's mother, confirming he was with her on the night of the theft. More importantly, we move to subpoena Mr. Chadwick Belmont III to testify." "On what grounds?" Pike protested weakly. "On the grounds that a mountain of evidence now suggests he is the real perpetrator," Rebecca's voice boomed. "He had access to the car Leo sat in. He has a documented interest in such vehicles, and the physical evidence on the stolen car points to a frame-up. The state's case against my client has evaporated. The only remaining question is who put his fingerprint there. We believe that person is Chad Belmont." Judge Harrington looked at Pike, his eyes filled with contempt. "Mr. Pike, do you have any evidence to refute this? Anything at all?" Pike was silent. He had nothing. He had built his case on the assumption of Leo's guilt and had been too lazy or too compromised to look any further. Harrington's jaw clenched. He knew what he had to do. His career was likely damaged beyond repair, his reputation as a discerning judge shattered. But he could, in this moment, choose to follow the law or become a co-conspirator. "The motion is granted," Harrington declared, his voice heavy. "A subpoena will be issued for Chadwick Belmont. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented here today, all charges against Mr. Leo Washington are hereby dismissed." A gasp, followed by an explosion of applause and camera flashes, filled the courtroom. Leo stood still for a moment, then slowly sat down, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. He then looked past the cheering crowd, past his crying mother who was rushing towards him, past the stunned face of Vincent Pike. His eyes found Judge Harrington. He gave a slow, small nod. It wasn't a nod of triumph or of thanks. It was a nod of finality, a sign that the game was truly over, and that the truth he had spoken had finally won. The dismissal of charges against Leo Washington was not the end of the story. It was the catalyst for a much larger collapse. The Chicago Tribune article had lit a fire, and the events in the courtroom poured gasoline on it. The name Belmont was now attached to a scandal, and the city's media machine, smelling blood, went into a frenzy. Chad Belmont, hiding in his father's palatial suburban mansion, was served the subpoena. His reaction was predictable: panic. Under the advice of a high-priced legal team hired by his father, He initially planned to plead the fifth, but the pressure was mounting. The forensic report on the mirror was public record. The dealership manager's testimony was undeniable. His carefully constructed wall of privilege was crumbling. The turning point came from an unexpected source. A former friend of Chad's, seeing his own name mentioned in a blog post as part of Chad's crew, contacted the DA's office through a lawyer. He offered to testify in exchange for immunity. He told investigators that Chad had been bragging for weeks about his genius plan to get back at his father for threatening to cut off his trust fund. The plan involved stealing his father's new Porsche, having a joyride, and then framing some random punk to show how clever he was. He had even shown the friend the rearview mirror, wrapped in a cloth in his glove compartment, days before the theft. Faced with this betrayal and the irrefutable evidence, Chad Belmont's legal team saw only one path. He surrendered to the authorities, his smug defiance replaced by the sullen terror of a boy who had never faced a real consequence in his life. He was charged with grand theft auto, filing a false police report, and felony perjury for the statements he'd given investigators. The fallout for ADA Vincent Pike was swift and brutal. An internal investigation was launched by the district attorney's office, spurred by the public outcry and the clear evidence of prosecutorial negligence at a minimum. The revelation of his past favors for Lawrence Belmont, brought to light by an investigative journalist who followed up on Leo's hunch, sealed his fate. He was accused of malicious prosecution and obstruction of justice. He was fired, disgraced, and faced disbarment. His career, built on ambition and cutting corners, was over. The heaviest karma, however, was reserved for Judge Arthur Harrington. His truth or lie game, once a private display of his own hubris, was now a public symbol of judicial misconduct. The Illinois Judicial Inquiry Board launched a formal investigation. Transcripts of the hearing were pored over by ethics committees. The story of him trying to humiliate a brilliant teenager, only to be systematically dismantled by him, made Harrington a laughingstock in the legal community and a villain in the public eye. He was forced to take an immediate leave of absence. Past cases he had presided over were scrutinized, with defense attorneys looking for patterns of bias and misconduct. The arrogant king of Cook County Superior Court was now a pariah, his 30-year career ending not with a respected retirement, but with a legacy of shame. He had sought to teach a boy a lesson about power, and in the end, he was the one who was truly schooled. For Leo Washington, life transformed. The story of the legal genius from Englewood who outsmarted an entire system became a national sensation. Scholarship offers poured in from top-tier universities, including the University of Chicago and Northwestern Law School. Pro bono legal groups and civil rights organizations championed his cause. He was no longer just a kid who got lucky. He was a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of intellect and integrity against a corrupt system. Rebecca Sloan found her career revitalized. Hailed for her defense of Leo, she was offered a partnership at a prestigious civil rights law firm. She left the public defender's office not with bitterness, but with a renewed commitment to fighting for those the system so easily discards. Her first act at her new firm was to establish the Leo Washington Fund, a scholarship program for underprivileged youth who showed an aptitude for law. One cool autumn afternoon, months later, Leo stood on the steps of the University of Chicago Law School, a place that had once seemed as distant as another planet. He held a thick constitutional law textbook, the weight of it feeling like a promise. He wasn't a defendant anymore. He wasn't a statistic. He was a student, a future lawyer, a future agent of the very change he had forced upon the world. He had walked into a courtroom as a suspect and walked out as a legend, proving that the most powerful weapon against a lie is not just the truth, but the brilliant, unyielding mind of someone who believes in it. The dismissal of charges against Leo Washington was not a period at the end of a sentence. It was an ellipsis, a pregnant pause before the true consequences began to unfold. The system that had so eagerly tried to devour him now turned with a slow and grinding inevitability upon its own. For the men who had underestimated the quiet boy from Englewood, Chad Belmont, Vincent Pike, and Judge Arthur Harrington, the true judgment was only just beginning. And for the patriarch who believed himself above it all, Lawrence Belmont, the final, most bitter lesson was yet to come. The trial of Chadwick Belmont III was a media spectacle. Gone was the swaggering, privileged youth from social media photos. In his place sat a gaunt, terrified 19-year-old, swallowed by a suit that seemed 2 sizes too big. In the front row, his father, Lawrence Belmont, sat like a stone statue, his face a mask of controlled fury. His immense wealth had bought his son the best legal team in Chicago, but even they could not build a fortress around a foundation of lies. Leo did not attend the trial. At the advice of Rebecca Sloan, he remained focused on preparing for his new life, away from the toxic glare of the courtroom. But his presence was everywhere. His meticulously prepared chain of logic, once just handwritten notes, was now a formal exhibit for the prosecution. His name was invoked by witnesses, his intelligence lauded by legal analysts, his phantom presence a constant reminder of the incredible chain of events he had set in motion. The prosecution, now led by a stern veteran from the Public Integrity Unit, simply had to follow the trail Leo had blazed. The dealership manager, Robert, testified to Chad's strange, prolonged inspection of the show car. The forensic expert presented 3D scans of the tampered screws on the rearview mirror, calling it an amateurish but cunning piece of evidence manipulation. The final nail in the coffin was Chad's former friend, whose testimony was chillingly precise. He recounted Chad boasting about the plan, laughing about how easy it would be to frame some project kid nobody would ever believe. Chad's expensive lawyers tried to paint Leo as an opportunist and the friend as a disgruntled liar. But it was useless. They were trying to argue against a truth that had already been proven. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, yet the word, when it was spoken by the foreman, landed like a physical blow on Lawrence Belmont. Guilty, on all counts. Chad collapsed into sobs, a spoiled child finally facing a consequence he couldn't escape. Lawrence Belmont did not move, did not even blink, but a deep, dark rage began to curdle within him. His son was going to prison, and it was all because of that boy. Simultaneously, in a sterile conference room across the city, the Illinois Judicial Inquiry Board convened to decide the fate of Judge Arthur Harrington. There was no jury, only a panel of his peers, other judges and lawyers who looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. The proceedings were excruciating. Harrington, stripped of his robes and his authority, was forced to sit and listen as the transcript of Leo's hearing was read aloud. His own words, dripping with condescension and prejudice, echoed in the silent room. "Are we in a courtroom or a campfire? You've watched some television." And the most damning line of all, the one that started the whole debacle, "Let's play a little game. We'll call it truth or lie." Witnesses were called. A former clerk testified that the judge frequently referred to defendants from poor neighborhoods with derogatory nicknames. A veteran bailiff spoke of the judge's God complex, but the central evidence was Harrington himself, immortalized on the court record. His defense was weak. He claimed he was merely using an unorthodox method to test the defendant's veracity. The panel was unmoved. The lead counsel for the board, a severe woman named Eleanor Vance, summed it up perfectly. Judge Harrington did not use an unorthodox method. He abused his power. He did not seek to find the truth. He sought to manufacture a confession through humiliation. He failed to be a judge of the law and instead appointed himself a judge of a boy's character based on nothing more than his address. The fact that he was so thoroughly and brilliantly outmaneuvered by his intended victim does not mitigate the offense. It merely highlights its foolishness. The board's recommendation was unanimous and brutal: permanent removal from the bench and a public censure. Arthur Harrington, the king of his courtroom, was dethroned and exiled, his 30-year career ending in a permanent stain of disgrace. For Vincent Pike, the fall was less public but just as complete. His disbarment hearing was a formality. His blatant failure to investigate, coupled with the now exposed history of favors for Lawrence Belmont, left him no defense. He was stripped of his license to practice law, a man who had perverted the law now forbidden from its practice. He was last seen packing his expensive suits into the trunk of a modest sedan, his career in ruins, a ghost in the legal system he once haunted. But Lawrence Belmont was not a man to accept defeat. His son was sentenced to 3 years in a medium-security prison. His reputation was damaged, but his fortune was intact, and so was his rage. He could not accept that a boy from the gutter had toppled his empire of influence. In his mind, Leo Washington wasn't a genius. He was a serpent who had charmed the city and poisoned his life. And Belmont decided to do what he had always done when faced with a problem: crush it with money. He hired a notorious crisis management firm known for its scorched earth tactics. Private investigators were dispatched to dig into every corner of Leo's life and his mother's. They interviewed disgruntled neighbors, estranged family members, and former teachers looking for any hint of dirt. When they found none, they began to manufacture it. Soon, sleazy online tabloids and fringe blogs began running stories. "The Genius of Englewood, A History of Deception?" one headline read. They twisted a story of Leo talking his way out of a school suspension in middle school into a pattern of manipulative behavior. They took his mother's hard-working life, with its multiple cleaning jobs, and tried to spin it as unstable. They paid a distant cousin to give a quote saying Leo was always too clever for his own good. It was a classic smear campaign designed to muddy the waters and poison the public's perception of their new hero. Leo, now a first-year student at the University of Chicago, saw the articles. They were a cruel distraction from the intellectual paradise he had found. For the first time since his arrest, he felt a flicker of fear. They weren't attacking his logic now. They were attacking his character, his family. He took the articles to Rebecca Sloan, who was now a partner at her civil rights firm. Rebecca's eyes blazed as she read them. "This has Lawrence Belmont's fingerprints all over it," she said, her voice tight with anger. "He lost in the courts of law, so now he's trying to win in the court of public opinion. He's trying to destroy your reputation before it even begins. We are not going to let that happen." Rebecca's firm immediately went on the offensive. They issued cease and desist letters to the blogs and threatened libel suits. But they also planned a more direct counterattack. "He wants to fight a dirty war, Leo," Rebecca explained. "We're going to drag him back into the one place he can't control the narrative with money, a deposition room." They filed a multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit against Lawrence Belmont for defamation, slander, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It was a bold, aggressive move, and it forced Belmont into a corner. The deposition took place months later in a sterile conference room in a downtown law office. Lawrence Belmont sat at one end of a long mahogany table, flanked by three stone-faced lawyers. At the other end sat Leo, Rebecca Sloan, and another partner from her firm. Leo was dressed not in a suit, but in a simple university sweater, a stark contrast to the corporate power arrayed against him. Belmont began with an air of utter contempt. "So this is the boy wonder," he sneered, looking at Leo as if he were an insect. "Come to squeeze a little more blood from the stone, have you?" His lawyers winced, but Belmont waved them off. He believed his power could still intimidate. He was wrong. Rebecca began the questioning, but after establishing the groundwork, she nodded to Leo. This was part of their strategy. "Mr. Belmont," Leo began, his voice calm and even, betraying no fear. "You hired the firm Veritas Reputation Management 3 weeks after your son's conviction, correct?" Belmont grunted. "I hire many firms. But you hired this one specifically to investigate me and my mother," Leo continued. "And shortly thereafter, articles containing false and defamatory information about us began to appear online. For example, an article on a site called The City Sentinel claims I was suspended for cheating in the 8th grade. The school's records, which we have subpoenaed, show I was suspended for 1 day for debating a teacher too aggressively about the historical inaccuracies in our textbook. In defamation law, this is known as portraying someone in a false light. Would you agree that the article's version is substantially different from the recorded facts?" Belmont stared. The boy was quoting legal concepts at him. "I don't read trashy websites. And yet your firm's invoices, which we have also subpoenaed, show a payment made to the City Sentinel for content placement. So you didn't just read it, Mr. Belmont. You paid for it," Leo said, his voice remaining level. He wasn't angry. He was dissecting. "You are a man who builds things. You understand foundations. You attempted to build a foundation of lies to ruin my character. But the foundation itself is rotten." For an hour, Leo continued, not with the fire of an accuser, but with the cool precision of a surgeon. He took every lie from the articles, every fabricated quote, and laid it bare against the verifiable truth. He was not just defending himself, he was demonstrating the malicious, calculated nature of Belmont's campaign. Belmont's arrogance began to crack, his face growing redder with every question. Finally, he snapped. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" he snarled, leaning across the table. "You are nothing. A street kid who got lucky. You ruined my son. You destroyed my family. I will spend every last dollar I have to make sure this city knows you are a fraud." His lawyers tried to restrain him, but the dam had broken. The rage and grief he had masked for so long poured out in a torrent of threats and invective. And it was all on the record, captured by the court stenographer and a video camera. Leo simply watched him, his expression one of almost clinical pity. When Belmont finally ran out of breath, sputtering in fury, Leo spoke his final words of the deposition. "Thank you, Mr. Belmont," he said softly. "You've just proven our entire case for malice. Rebecca, I have no further questions for the witness." It was over. Lawrence Belmont's own rage had handed them the final victory. Faced with the certainty of a catastrophic loss in court, Belmont settled. The amount was confidential but rumored to be in the 8 figures. On Leo's instruction, every penny went directly into the Leo Washington Fund, now renamed the Washington Sloan Foundation for Systemic Justice, with enough capital to help hundreds of kids for decades to come. The smear campaign backfired, making Leo an even more beloved figure. He had faced down not just a flawed system, but the raw, vengeful power of a billionaire, and he had won. The story ends not in a courtroom, but in the quiet, sun-drenched library of the University of Chicago. Leo is sitting with a young high school girl from his old neighborhood, helping her with an application essay for a pre-law summer program funded by his foundation. He is patient, encouraging, explaining a complex idea with simple clarity. He had become everything his enemies were not: a builder, a mentor, a force for good. He had walked into the fire as a boy and emerged as a man, having learned the ultimate truth: that true power isn't the ability to manipulate the world, but the intelligence and courage to change it. In the end, it wasn't just a car that was stolen. It was justice itself that had been hijacked by prejudice and power. But a 17-year-old boy, armed with nothing but his own mind and the truth, stole it right back. Leo Washington's story is a powerful reminder that one person's courage can expose the deepest flaws in our systems. Judge Harrington, ADA Pike, and Chad Belmont faced their reckoning, a hard karma that reminded the world that no one is above the law. These are the stories we need to hear. Stories where the underdog doesn't just win, but changes the entire game. If this story of intelligence triumphing over injustice moved you, please hit that like button to show your support. Share it with others who need to see that truth can still win. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have so many more incredible real-life stories of karma and justice coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.